Greetings. In the last mini lecture, I introduced the concept of cooperative federalism. And in cooperative federalism, remember that we are emphasizing the partnerships that exist between governments, particularly the national government and the states. And notice that I gave you an example of both a Democrat and a Republican who bought into this concept. Talked about first Franklin Roosevelt responding to the Great Depression with the New Deal, and then a very conservative, at least fiscally conservative, Dwight Eisenhower was the architect of the interstate highway system, which was a very costly grant program, but in my mind, a very successful program. It's my belief that most people, whether they are conservative or liberal, believe that government has a place. For example, I mentioned the childhood nutrition program that I participated in for a while as a child, and my guess is some of you were also the beneficiaries of this government program, the childhood nutrition program. What's interesting and what most people don't realize is that the first lobbyists on behalf of the childhood nutrition program was actually a very conservative institution, and that was the U.S. military. During the Second World War, we noticed what the ravages of the Great Depression was in human terms. In many cases, young men went to volunteer for military duty, and because of the ravages of childhood malnutrition, they were unfit for military combat. And so the U.S. military became a very early advocate for the childhood nutrition program, especially during the Cold War, saying that we should always have a healthy conscript pool. So the lazy temptation is to assume, well, liberals want big government and conservatives want small government, and that's not always true. A lot of conservatives, for example, want a large military, which is a government program. The childhood nutrition program, spearheaded at first by conservatives. Obviously, liberals agreed for a different reason. I just told you that the interstate highway system, a very costly program, was pioneered by a Republican president. So I think that in a bipartisan way, we usually see a demand for government to help solve problems. Where liberals and conservatives usually disagree is that they usually, not always, but often want different problems solved, and often they want that problem solved in different ways. In today's mini lecture, I want to talk about the Great Society with Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is the first president that I really remember as president. Of course, Lyndon Johnson initially became president because of a great tragedy, the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963. I was a 5-year-old, but I do remember the event, and I don't think I would have, except it was the first time I ever saw my father cry. I didn't think my father was really capable of tears, and my mom were both upset that President Kennedy had been killed. I had no idea of who President Kennedy was or why it was important, but the fact that my parents were acting strange made me remember the event. So turn to Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. If you take a look at your notes, the Great Society had two major goals, two major objectives, and the goals are very noble. I think each and every one of us would agree that these goals are worthwhile. Probably most of us would wonder, can government really do these things? But certainly the attempt, I think, is noteworthy. So, ending racial discrimination and ending poverty. For believers in the nation-centered view of federalism, like your textbook authors, the Great Society was a logical idea. Only the national government had the resources to take on national problems. For critics, for people who were more state-centered, these governmental programs were wasteful, they were overly bureaucratic, they were highly inflexible. And in reality, both sides kind of have a point. If you are a defender in the Great Society, you would point out that this was the last time in American history where income and wealth inequality actually decreased. Those at the bottom in percentage terms actually did better than those at the top, and we had greater equity during these years in terms of income, for example. Critics would point out that if you throw enough money at a problem, you're going to get some results, but the cost was way too high. For people who defend the Great Society programs, they're going to point out that these programs worked pretty well in rural areas. For critics, they're going to say these programs did not work nearly as well in urban areas. And so, to be honest with you, both the defenders and the opponents of the Great Society exaggerate their claims. There's no question the Great Society had some very, very positive results, but some could criticize whether the cost was too high. So let's start with ending racial discrimination. For people who are big fans of Lyndon Johnson, this is probably his greatest accomplishment. I would claim that Lyndon Johnson's greatest accomplishment as president was getting three landmark civil rights acts passed in 1964, 1965, and 1968. When Lyndon Johnson was asked what he considered the greatest accomplishment of his presidency, his response was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I personally would rank the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as his greatest accomplishment. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, I will talk about in great detail in Civil Rights, but essentially it outlawed private discrimination. The U.S. and Supreme Court, the Supreme Court in 1883, in a series of cases actually called the Civil Rights cases, had ruled that private discrimination was legal, that it was a property rights issue, that people should have the right to do what they want with their own property, even if that means discriminating against whole groups of people. The Civil Rights Act said, in essence, if you are in a business designed to serve the general public, you have an obligation to serve the general public. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1964 upheld the Civil Rights Act. So I think you could have an argument over whether the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the greatest accomplishment of Johnson's presidency. They were both tremendously, they were huge accomplishments. Now, did they end racial discrimination? Of course not. Did they take some very positive steps to eliminate some of the most overt forms of discrimination? The answer would be absolutely. Besides those three programs that I mentioned in 1964, 65, and 68, Johnson also pioneered a new and controversial program which began in federal contracting, a program that became known as affirmative action. And later, when we get to civil rights, we will talk about the pros and cons of affirmative action and what this has meant in society. The second major goal, ending poverty, is one near and dear to me. I told you I grew up very poor. I once had a very interesting question from a student who asked me, said, Mr. Randall, is being run over by your dad's drunk mistress your worst memory of childhood? And to the student's surprise, because, my students always laugh about how I rank everything, I said, no, being run over is actually my third worst memory of childhood. And student said, that's being run over and nearly killed is number three. I go, yeah, number one was I was 5 or 6. We never really had much money. My dad was going to get paid the next day, and all that was left in the house was And I don't remember exactly what it was. I'm going to call it a little kind of mini can of raviolis because it was this doughy stuff with meat in it. So I'm assuming it was raviolis. It might have been called something else. And that was all that was left. So my mom cooked up the little can of raviolis, and there was a little bit of milk left. And so I had this can of raviolis and this half a glass of milk for dinner. And there was no food left for mom or dad. Now, with dad, I didn't feel particularly guilty, but I remember looking at mom and feeling tremendous guilt that I was eating dinner and there was no dinner for mom. And I remember even as a young kid almost throwing it up and feeling tremendous guilt that if I hadn't been born, my mom would be eating. Interesting. Never thought about dad eating. Always it was mom. So poverty is a horrible thing materially, but it is also a horrible thing psychologically. Now, to combat poverty, Johnson created over 200 new grant programs. Think about that. Remember, the New Deal was only 16 programs, and now we have this explosion of government, this large permanent bureaucratic state in Washington. 109 of them in 1965 alone. So many of these programs you've heard of: Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary School Act, Model Cities, Medicaid, Vista. There's a whole bunch of them that obviously are not mentioned. Were these programs successful? The record is kind of mixed. I'm a big fan of Medicare and Medicaid. I'm one of these people that believe that health care is a human right, that every individual should have access to health care just like all Americans should have access to a K to 12 education. These programs did work better in small towns and rural areas than they did in large cities. These programs did increase income inequality. And remember, I told you that today, in the last 40 years, income inequality has consistently increased to where today we have the greatest wealth and income inequality of any advanced industrial democratic society in the world. Once again, it is a matter of perspective. If you are a believer in nation-centered federalism, you believe that the national government had an obligation to take on poverty, that the national government had an obligation to take on racial discrimination. If you are more state-centered, you might take one of two approaches. If you're more state-centered, you might say that the national government should not be involved in this at all. It's taking far too much taxpayer money. It's wasteful, it's inefficient. The other conservative approach is, okay, we understand that the national government has the deep pockets. Only the national government can fund these programs, and we will reluctantly go along with it. However, we want the national government to funnel this money to state and local decision makers, and we want the national government to empower state and local decision makers to make the decisions that are most appropriate for their communities. Because, for example, if we're talking about community health might be very different in Merced and Stanislaus County, where we have very young populations. So we may want things like infant and childhood nutrition programs and childhood immunization programs or prenatal care and screenings. But if we are an elderly community in southern Florida, we don't want programs targeting young people. We're a community of older people, so we want those funding dollars to go for the needs of the elderly, whether it be ambulatory services like electric scooters, or hearing aids, or vision treatment, or whatever it happens to be. So the Great Society is, in essence, what the great debate about government is today. How large, how powerful should the national government be, and to what extent should the national government take on problems of national scope? In the next lecture, I will talk about the two conservative reactions to the great society. Have a great day, everyone.